You won't believe what this man did to me when I was at my lowest, and you'll be even more shocked when you find out how I took everything from him years later. He left me homeless, broke, and alone, and by the time I was done, I owned the roof over his head. Stick around, because this is one of the coldest revenges you'll ever hear. My name's Ethan, and I'll never forget the day my whole life came crashing down. I was 24, broke, and just barely hanging on. I had lost my job at a small tech startup after the company suddenly shut down overnight. No severance, no backup plan, just a worthless promise that we'd stay in touch. And to make things worse, my so-called best friend Mason, the one guy who I thought would always have my back, was about to betray me in a way I couldn't even imagine. Mason wasn't just my roommate, he was practically like a brother. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same high school, and even moved to the city together to chase our careers. He always seemed like a decent guy, a little flashy, a little cocky, but never someone I thought would stab me in the back. When I lost my job, I thought he'd understand. I figured we'd work something out until I got back on my feet. But no, Mason saw my struggle as an opportunity to crush me. The night it happened, I came home to find my stuff packed in boxes and sitting by the door. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick prank, so I laughed and asked him what the joke was. But the look in his eyes told me it was no joke. "Time's up, bro," he said coldly. "You haven't paid rent in 2 months, and I've covered for you long enough. I need someone reliable around here." I tried to reason with him, begged for a little more time, but Mason wasn't having it. He told me he'd already found a new roommate, some rich guy from his office, and that I had to leave immediately. No warning, no chance to figure things out, just pure cold-blooded eviction. It was pouring rain outside when I carried my last box to the curb. I had nowhere to go, no family nearby, and the few friends I had were either out of town or barely scraping by themselves. I ended up sleeping in my car that night, soaked and shivering, staring at my old apartment window and watching Mason laugh with his new roommate through the glass. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I promised myself that night, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it got, one day I'd make Mason pay. And not just a little payback. I was going to ruin him. The next few months were hell. I scraped together cash doing odd jobs, delivering food, moving furniture, cleaning offices, anything I could find. There were nights I slept in my car, others on cheap motel floors, sometimes at all-night diners pretending to be a customer just to stay warm. But every single day, I kept one thing alive in my head, the vision of Mason's face when I took everything from him. I started studying everything I could about real estate, finance, business ownership. I read books at the library, watched YouTube tutorials for hours, and took free online courses. I knew Mason's weakness. He was reckless with money and obsessed with appearing rich. If I could get a foothold in the real estate game, I could one day outbid him on his own home. I didn't have a single dollar to my name, but I had obsession, focus, and one hell of a reason to fight. After about a year of hustling, I caught my first break. I met a guy named Lucas while working a temp job delivering office supplies. Lucas was a mid-level real estate investor who specialized in flipping rundown properties. We struck up a conversation about business, and I told him everything from my eviction to my dream of getting into the game. Maybe he saw something in me. Maybe he was just in a generous mood, but Lucas gave me a shot. He hired me as a part-time assistant, helping him with property viewings, paperwork, and renovations. It wasn't much, but it was my foot in the door. I learned fast how to spot a good deal, how to negotiate, how to manage contractors, and most importantly, how to think like a boss. Within 2 years, I'd saved enough to invest in my first small property, a rundown duplex in a sketchy neighborhood. I lived in one unit, rented the other, and did most of the repairs myself. Slowly but surely, I built my credit, my savings, and my reputation. By the 3rd year, I'd flipped 2 more properties and started my own small company, ED Investments. Every time I made a deal, I remembered Mason. Every time a tenant paid rent, I imagined buying his apartment building. It became my obsession. Fast forward to 5 years after that rainy night, and I wasn't the same broke kid Mason tossed on the street. I was a legitimate real estate developer with a portfolio of residential and commercial properties across the city. And one day, the opportunity I'd been waiting for dropped right into my lap. I was browsing new listings when I saw it. Mason's building was up for sale. Not just his unit, but the entire 6-unit apartment complex. The owner had passed away, and his kids wanted to cash out fast. It was an off-market deal, listed quietly through a small agency, and they were desperate to sell. I called Lucas, now my business partner, and within a week, we made a cash offer well below market value. The heirs didn't care. They just wanted to get rid of it quickly. No inspections, no delays. Just a clean, quiet sale. And just like that, I owned the building Mason lived in. I didn't show up at his door right away. No, I had bigger plans. I made some upgrades, raised the rent on the other tenants, and waited for Mason to either notice or fall behind. And of course, true to his old habits, Mason was 2 months behind on rent when I took ownership. I sent a formal eviction notice through a property management company, giving him 30 days to vacate. He had no idea it was me behind the scenes. But when the day came, and he stormed into the property office demanding to speak to the new owner, I made sure to be there. I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked in and saw me sitting behind the desk. He froze, his mouth hanging open, color draining from his face like he'd seen a ghost. I leaned back, smiled, and said, "Hey, bro, time's up." But that's not even the best part. Because what I did next was so cold, so ruthless, it made everything I went through worth it. Mason stood there frozen like a deer caught in headlights, his eyes darting from me to the eviction notice clutched in his hand, and back to me again, as if his brain couldn't process what was happening. And honestly, I didn't blame him, because 5 years ago, I was the one standing in front of him soaked in the rain, homeless, hopeless, and humiliated, while he stood smugly in the doorway of our apartment and told me to get lost. And now, here he was, in my office, inside a building with my name on the deed, with me holding all the power, and you could see every ounce of that realization hit him like a brick to the face. And for a moment, I let the silence hang in the air, savoring the delicious tension, because this was the moment I'd fantasized about on every miserable night I spent sleeping in my car, the moment that kept me grinding through every long day of backbreaking labor and paperwork. And now it was here, and it was better than I ever imagined. Finally, Mason cleared his throat and tried to puff up his chest like he still had some kind of leverage, slapping the eviction notice down on my desk and saying, "There's got to be some kind of mistake. Man, I've lived here for years. You can't just kick me out like this. And I swear to you, the nerve of this guy to play the victim was almost impressive, because the only mistake that had been made was not throwing him out of my life sooner." And I leaned forward, folded my hands together, and said with the calmest voice I could muster, "No mistake. Mason, you've been behind on rent, and the new owner doesn't tolerate freeloaders." And watching the realization spread across his face when he finally grasped that I was the new owner, that I was the one who had bought his precious home right out from under him, was pure cinematic gold. And for a second, he tried to laugh it off, like this was some kind of prank or sick joke. But when I didn't flinch, when I just stared him down with that same look he once gave me, his confidence crumbled in an instant. What are you even doing here, man?" he stammered, his voice cracking, and I could see the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, because deep down he knew exactly what this was about. But I wasn't about to let him off that easy, so I told him, "I own this place now. Mason, every unit, every square foot of this building. And in exactly 28 days, I want you out, or I'll have you removed." And I could tell he wanted to argue, to yell, to throw a fit, but he didn't, because in that moment, Mason realized that I had finally become the man he once pretended to be, the one with power, resources, and options, while he was just a broke, washed-up parasite clinging to the scraps of his old life. And then came the begging, because I knew it would. It always does. And sure enough, he leaned forward and said, "Look, Ethan, buddy, we've known each other a long time. Man, you know I've been going through some stuff. I can get you the rent. I just need a little time." But the thing is, I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about his excuses, because this wasn't about rent. It was about payback, pure and simple. And so I told him, "Not happening, Mason, but I'll tell you what. I'm hiring maintenance guys for some of my other properties. Minimum wage, long hours, no benefits. You interested?" And watching his face twist with humiliation was everything I hoped it would be. But it didn't stop there, because revenge is a dish best served cold, and I had been freezing this one for 5 long years, so I had one more move up my sleeve, and it was a good one. See, during those years I'd built connections, not just in real estate, but in finance, property management, even local politics, and I knew things about Mason he probably didn't even remember telling me back when he was drunk or trying to brag, like how he'd been lying on his tax returns for years, underreporting his freelance income, and claiming deductions for things he never actually paid for. And while a younger, angrier version of me might have called the IRS out of spite, older, smarter, Ethan had a better idea. I reached out to an old contact at the city's housing department and tipped them off about some suspicious activity involving Mason's subletting arrangements in the building before I bought it. Because see, Mason used to brag about how he'd rent out his unit on weekends through short-term rental apps without the landlord's knowledge, pocketing cash under the table. And that, my friend, is a big no-no in this city without the right permits. And now that I owned the building, those violations were technically my problem, unless I reported them first, and then they became Mason's. Within a week, he got slapped with a hefty fine and a formal investigation notice, which meant he couldn't just quietly move out and start fresh somewhere else. Oh no, he had to deal with city inspectors crawling all over his unit, asking questions, combing through financial records, and making his life a living nightmare. And every time I saw him on the property, his eyes sunken, shoulders slumped, I felt a little piece of my old pain dissolve, replaced by something colder, sharper, and honestly, I didn't even feel bad about it, because Mason had never once apologized, never once admitted what he did to me. And if the roles were reversed, I knew he wouldn't have hesitated to do the same or worse. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for him, fate tossed me one final, delicious curveball. About a month after Mason finally moved out, or rather, was forced out after failing to pay the fines, my company put out a job listing for a new leasing assistant at one of our downtown properties. Entry-level, basic office work, nothing glamorous, but steady pay and benefits. And guess whose resume showed up in the applicant pile? That's right, Mason freaking Carter. And when I saw his name, I couldn't believe it. Part of me thought it had to be a joke, but curiosity got the better of me. So I scheduled an interview under a fake name, acting as the hiring manager. And when he walked into that office in a wrinkled shirt and scuffed shoes, looking like a man who'd been chewed up and spit out by life, I barely recognized him. And for a split second, I wondered if this was overkill, if maybe I should just let it go. But then I remembered the night I slept in my car, watching Mason through that apartment window, laughing with his new roommate while I shivered in the rain, and any pity I had evaporated. The interview was brutal, and not because I was cruel or aggressive, but because I let him squirm, answering questions he clearly wasn't prepared for, struggling to spin his disastrous work history. And then, at the very end, when he asked if there was any chance of getting hired, I finally dropped the act, leaned forward, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "Sorry, Mason, we don't tolerate unreliable people around here." And the way his face crumbled, the way the color drained from his cheeks, it was better than any paycheck I'd ever received, and he didn't even say a word, just stood up, nodded, and walked out the door without looking back. I wish I could tell you that after that brutal interview, Mason disappeared from my life for good, slinking away into whatever shadowy corner of the city that would have him. But people like Mason have a way of crawling back when you least expect it. And sure enough, about 3 months later, just when I thought the chapter was closed, I get a call from the manager of one of my lower-end rental properties out near the outskirts of town, and the guy sounds rattled, says there's been some trouble with a new tenant who was caught trying to scam other residents, collecting fake deposits for units he didn't own. And when they cornered the guy in his apartment, guess who it turned out to be? Yep, Mason Carter, living under a fake name, broke, desperate, and hustling people for a couple $100 at a time just to make rent. And when the manager asked what I wanted to do about it, I didn't even hesitate. Because by now this wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about making sure a snake like Mason never had a chance to bite anyone else out. I drove over there myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. And when Mason opened that door and saw me standing there, The color drained from his face so fast you'd swear he was about to pass out, and for a moment neither of us spoke, just stared at each other, and looking like a ghost of the cocky, smug bastard who once kicked me out into the rain. And me standing there with the satisfaction of knowing that every single move I made since that night led to this exact moment. Finally, I broke the silence and said, "You've got 10 minutes to pack your stuff, or I'm calling the cops." And this time there was no argument, no fake bravado, just a pathetic, exhausted nod as he grabbed a duffel bag and started stuffing it with whatever junk he had left. And I stood there watching like a warden overseeing a prisoner's final walk. But it still wasn't over, because as he was leaving, he had the nerve to stop, turn around, and say, "Look, Ethan, I know I messed up, man. I did you dirty. I lost everything. I've got nowhere else to go. Please, just help me out. Anything. I'll work for you, scrub floors, whatever it takes." And for a split second, I almost pitied him, because there was nothing left of the Mason Carter I used to know, just a hollow, broken man begging for scraps. But then I remembered all those nights I spent freezing in my car, all the jobs I worked just to eat, all the deals I had to claw my way through to get to where I was, and I knew this wasn't a mercy story, this was a lesson. So I told him, "You made your bed, Mason. Now you get to sleep in it," and I shut the door in his face. After that, I figured it was truly the end, until 2 weeks later, when one of my leasing agents came into my office with a stack of job applications for a new security position we were hiring at one of the properties, and there it was again. Mason Carter's name, scribbled in shaky handwriting, attached to a desperate little cover letter begging for a second chance, and I swear, I almost laughed, because at this point it was getting ridiculous, like some bad karma boomerang that kept coming back around. But this time I didn't even bother calling him, didn't set up a fake interview, didn't entertain it for a second. I took that application, walked it right to the shredder, and dropped it in without a word. And that, my friend, is how it really ends. Not with a final showdown, not with some dramatic apology or last-ditch scheme, but with quiet, humiliating failure. I never saw Mason Carter again after that, and from what I've heard through the grapevine, he left town a few months later, probably chasing some new scam or sob story in a different city, and honestly, good riddance. Because some people don't learn, and some people don't deserve a comeback, and Mason was one of them. But if there's one thing this whole insane saga taught me, it's that life has a funny way of evening the score, if you're patient, if you put your head down and grind. And if you never, ever forget who left you standing in the rain. And hey, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more wild, true revenge tales just like this one, do me a favor, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on those notifications, because I've got plenty more jaw-dropping stories coming your way real soon. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.